From 1945 to 1990, the permanent members of the Security Council cast the following number of vetoes: China, 3. France, 18. United Kingdom, 30. US, 69, and the Soviet Union, 114. Then between June 1990 and May 1993, there was no single veto. Although many vetoing attempts occurred later on, the post-Cold War capacity of the Security Council to reach agreement has survived, in general, and constituted a key reason for the increase in the number of peacekeeping operations. The Permanent Court of Arbitration, PCA, was established by the Convention for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes in 1899 during the First Hague Peace Conference. The PCA is the first intergovernmental organization to facilitate the resolution of international disputes among states through arbitration and other peaceful means. The types and motivations of third parties in conflict resolution. Third-party interventions in international conflicts are usually carried out by states, intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, as well as local leaders. Intervening states are likely to seek terms that may increase the prospects of stability, deny their rivals opportunities for intervention, earn the gratitude of one or both parties, or enable them to continue to have a role in future relations. Both defensive and offensive goals can be promoted through intervention. States act defensively when a continuing conflict threatens the state's direct interests. The offensive motive, on the other hand, involves the desire to extend and increase influence. In this case, the solution of the conflict has no direct significance for the state intervening and is only a vehicle for improving relations with one or both parties. The interventions by international organizations are somewhat more complex than those of states. Peace itself would be the main reason for most international organizations. Yet intergovernmental organizations are also subject to certain policies and interests of their member states. Hence, they may be in a position to maximize such policies and interests in exercising intervention activities. NGOs are generally free to act in ways that nation-states and other intermediaries are not. Because of their transnational identities, they can hold the world public interests above national interests in ways that neither the nation-states nor even the UN itself can do. Thus, many peace-building activities that require time, effort, and patience can be better dealt with by NGOs. The interventions by local leaders, finally, somehow share motives of self-interest, although their interests are not as apparent as the primary players of power politics. At the very least, local leaders have a role and a reputation for establishing, or defending, as successful interveners. Concern for peace may be valuable in and of itself for many local leaders, too, as they believe in inherent desirability. The evolution, strengths, and weaknesses of the peacekeeping operations of the United Nations, UN. Peacekeeping in international conflicts is an activity that involves the interposition of military and police forces between conflicting groups, either to stop the violence or to prevent it. Peacekeeping operations are not limited to the efforts of the UN only, it can be performed by other international organizations or a group of states as well. Nonetheless, the UN has a special place in talking about peacekeeping due to its grand mission of being a guardian of international peace and security. The first operation, the UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO, was created in 1948 to supervise the truce called for by the UN Security Council in Palestine. As they evolved from the 1950s to the 1980s, the traditional tasks of UN peacekeeping operations included interposing between conflicting parties and monitoring ceasefires. These tasks were usually carried out of three key principles: consent of the parties, impartiality, and non-use of force. Since mid-1988, there has been a great expansion in the number of peacekeeping forces. Just from May 1988 to October 1993, a further 20 forces were created. The main reason for this expansion has been the increased capacity of the UN Security Council to agree on the action in security crises after the end of the Cold War. A further reason was also linked with the end of the Cold War, in that the post-Cold War era has generally generated an increasing need for international peacekeeping forces. In the early 1990s, a series of peace agreements on Afghanistan, Angola, Namibia, Central America, and Cambodia called for impartial international forces to assist in implementing ceasefires, troop withdrawals, and elections. Besides, the collapse of two federal communist states, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, produced many ethnic conflicts that called for active UN interventions. Apart from the numerical increase in peacekeeping forces, since the end of the Cold War, UN peacekeeping operations have also involved a great number of activities that have been either new or implemented on a much larger scale than before. These are monitoring and even running local elections, protecting certain areas as safe zones from adversary attacks, guarding the weapons surrendered by or taken from the parties in conflict, ensuring the smooth delivery of humanitarian relief supplies, and assisting in the reconstruction of state functions in war-torn societies. The main functions of third parties in peace-building processes. Third parties can assume especially four types of roles as peace builders. These include the provision of humanitarian relief to people in emergencies, the rehabilitation functions, peacemaking activities, and sustaining peace through multi-track interventions. The provision of humanitarian aid to the needy is the first and most urgent thing to do in conflict settings. Third parties participating in humanitarian relief operations should maintain a policy of strict neutrality, defining their role as providers of aid to those in need without regard to political, ethnic, or religious affiliation. The rehabilitation functions refer to dealing with institutional, economic, social, and political problems in war-torn societies, as these issues are often related to the conflict itself. Failing to respond in a timely fashion may create the conditions for a return to organized violence. Early action is primarily needed to help rehabilitate the infrastructure that is crucial to an economic revival, as well as to stabilize both national currency and financial institutions. Peacemaking activities, in general, refer to actions by third parties to bring hostile parties to an agreement. Peacemaking activities, in general, refer to actions by third parties to bring hostile parties to an agreement. Third parties can perform this role in basically four ways: conciliation, consultation, arbitration, and mediation. Conciliation is an alternative out-of-jurisdiction conflict resolution instrument. It is a process whereby the conflicting parties use a conciliator that meets with the parties both separately and together in an attempt to resolve their differences. Arbitration is a binding way of conflict resolution outside the courts or legal procedures. The conflict is decided by one or more persons, the arbitrator, and is legally binding on both sides. Mediation, on the other hand, is a process in which a neutral third party helps conflicting parties to find a mutually acceptable solution to their conflict. Third parties can also play a significant role in sustaining peace. Sustaining peace, in a generic sense, refers to multi-track intervention strategies aimed at terminating conflict and building durable peace. Such strategies involve developing symmetric interdependence, revising formal education, as well as building intercommunal confidence. This can be done through organizing contact and acquaintance programs, positive action by the mass media, and exhortation by local community leaders or opinion makers. The so-called Track 2 diplomacy is another significant way of coping with relational issues, referring to unofficial, informal interaction between members of adversary groups. Third-party intervention means the involvement of an external party in a conflict to manage and resolve a conflict. Until the 1980s, the traditional tasks of UN peacekeeping operations included interposing between conflicting parties and monitoring ceasefires. Consultation refers to a small group problem-solving method for the study and resolution of a conflict whereby a consultant or consultants give information, opinion, and advice to conflicting parties to direct them to reach a mutually acceptable solution. Libya is one of the countries that acted as a third-party actor in the Sudanese conflict in 1999. William Zartman introduced the term ripeness in conflict resolution. The reasons for the expansion of peacekeeping operations in the post-Cold War era. The collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of Yugoslavia. Calls for monitoring the implementation of ceasefires in many countries. The decreasing ideological clashes between the US and the Soviet Union. The main roles of third parties in peace building. Provision of humanitarian relief. Rehabilitation functions. Peacemaking activities. Multi-track interventions to sustain peace. The typical roles of a mediator. Opening contacts and carrying messages. Providing ideas or possible solutions. Initiating proposals which originate from one or other party. Acting as a substitute source of ideas or proposals. According to Muzaffar Sharif, the pursuit of superordinate goals can help overcome stereotyping and reduce hostility among groups. Track 2 diplomacy refers to an unofficial, informal interaction between members of adversary groups or nations aiming to develop strategies, influence public opinion, and organize human and material resources in ways that might help resolve their conflict. Type of third parties which can particularly be helpful in trying to resolve an international conflict. It depends on the situation, since an international conflict is a dynamic process involving different phases. In this respect, sometimes preventive diplomacy by local actors and NGOs might be particularly useful before a conflict starts or after violent conflict has abated to avoid relapse. Yet if the conflict is already violent, heavier tactics may be utilized to stop violence by powerful third parties who have the capacity and leverage to do so, such as the UN and strong states of the international system. Likewise, in post-conflict societies, multiple interventions by different third parties may be required to respond to a complex set of issues that must be addressed rapidly. The UN has no standing army or police force on its own. Military and police personnel are derived from UN member states in accordance with their contribution after the UN Security Council decides to set up a peacekeeping mission. The peacekeepers in peacekeeping missions around the world are members of their national service first and are seconded to work with the UN. They wear their country's uniforms and are identified as UN peacekeepers by a UN blue helmet or beret. When the mission is over, the blue helmets go back to their countries. The role of mediation in resolving international conflicts. While international conflict is an omnipresent phenomenon of international interaction, mediation is a significant way of third-party intervention that can minimize the destructive consequences of international conflict and make an important contribution to the process of peaceful resolution. Since mediation is a voluntary process, the parties are more likely to reach a mutually acceptable solution. Mediation may build relationships through the exchange of ideas and proposals. Further, it may help the parties uncover the interests and values that explain their perspectives. In short, creating an opportunity for conflicting parties to explore constructive approaches for dealing with conflict, mediation may produce a win-win solution, and hence lasting peace, provided that the process is completed.